So I will introduce myself. Good morning, Kate Rosenblum, and I am a professor of psychiatry and OB/GYN, but I'm a developmental and clinical psychologist by training, and I work at the University of Michigan in Michigan Medicine. And my passion, the work that I love to do, is really to think about how we can support families who have experienced disruptions and young children who have experienced trauma and loss. So probably something that is very near and dear to the hearts of all of you here. And I suspect that part of what I'm going to be talking about today is really going to be preaching to the choir in some ways. And I just hope that if that's the case, some of what I present just gives you a little bit more sort of background and support for the things that you value and the things that you do, because this is the most important work. I also have the privilege of being the psychologist consultant to the Child Advocacy Law Clinic with Dr. Kay and Dr. Sankaran. So I get to hear about and consult on cases that probably you all are involved in on a regular basis. And this work has really contributed to a passion and a conviction of mine to reduce removals whenever possible. And so that's really the punchline. That's what you're going to be hearing about. And I'm so excited about what's happening in Washtenaw in Judge Connor's court, because I think it really is very consistent, not only with my personal beliefs, but actually what the evidence tells us is really important if we're in this for child welfare. So, all right, so this is a recent quote from Dr. Chuck Nelson. There's so much research on the harm of removal that if people paid attention to all the science, they would never do this. So this quote came up around separating kids from their parents at the border, which actually gave rise to an enormous groundswell of researchers in my field talking to one another and saying, hey, what can we do, what can we do? Which I was very happy about, because it was appalling to see what was happening. And all the protections that exist within our child welfare system, you know, we've clearly thought about this, but wasn't something that was being practiced in that context. But what was really interesting to me was how everyone was coming together around these consensus statements. And I was like, wait a second, but this is happening every day across the country. So why aren't we all sort of, thinking with the sort of passion and conviction in the same way about how this is affecting kids nationally? All right. So just to summarize what I suspect most of you know, because as we've been really focusing on developmental affective neuroscience, people have become really familiar with some of the things that were new just a few years ago. So raise your hand if you know what cortisol is. Yeah, okay, so the stress hormone, right? What's really important for us to remember is that experiences that happen at times of the organization of the brain have a much greater impact on later development. And so things that happen in the first 1,000 days of life, where the brain is really rapidly developing and organizing itself, becomes sort of integral to who the person is. It gets built into their, sort of hardwired into their system, and gets carried forward. There are two major developmental periods of sort of organization and brain growth. So first being the first 1,000 days, when is the next one? Adolescence, that's right, puberty. So these are two times where we see big sort of developmental growth, and that means that the brain is particularly sensitive to experience at those times, and it becomes very much a part of the biology of the person. Experiences of stress and the corresponding sort of neurophysiological responses, like the sort of excess cortisol, can have a negative impact on development in those contexts. So this is really one of the mechanisms that we think about how stress and adversity get under the skin and sort of get carried forward. And there's a very famous book called The Body Keeps the Score that really sort of speaks to how these kinds of experiences get sort of built into your body and carried forward. So of course this is not good, because cortisol is neurotoxic, and it has a number of well-documented effects, not only in terms of essentially killing brain cells, but also reducing the development of new brain cells and affecting how brain cells are connected. So next slide. We now, this is pretty much in the popular media, right? We now know that that sort of accumulation of stress and the accumulation of harm to the brain actually leads to different brain composition, brain mass, brain structure, and that's pretty sobering, right? So kids who experience profound neglect, for example, are on average born with smaller brain mass and with larger sort of spaces in the brain that wouldn't exist had they experienced that sort of nurture early in life. But I do want to acknowledge that we're not in this sort of business, this work, because kids are in great situations typically before they're removed, right? So I want to acknowledge that context, that we're in this because I suspect we all share a passion for kids, right? And we share a passion for families, hopefully, too. So the sort of thing that I want to pose is that we're in this for child welfare, and we have to be very careful about how we frame this so that it doesn't become a question of whether we're looking at family preservation versus child protection, right? But family preservation is our mode towards child protection, and how do we really do that in the most effective way? Anyone familiar with the term iatrogenic? Okay, so Dr. K, okay, the psychologist here. So what I am referring to is really something very common that we talk about all the time in medicine, which is the thing that we do to sort of help can also cause harm. And this doesn't mean that you don't always do the thing that you know is going to help. It may be worth it, but we have to do it with our eyes wide open to the possible iatrogenic effects. And this is partly my message. I just want to sort of give this frame, which is, it's not that I'm telling you you have to do this or you can't do that, or that certain decisions are off the table, but rather we can't ignore the realities of what we are doing, and we have to keep open eyes to them and acknowledge it and make a decision that takes into account those realities and weighs them reasonably against the other risks that exist, right? All right, so how many of you have seen this film before? All right. Anyone heard of the still face? A couple of people are nodding. Okay, this comes from a film called Helping Babies from the Bench that was put out by an organization called 0 to 3. And this is a well-established procedure that we use in research all the time for a number of different reasons. But what it does is it has a parent look at their baby and play, and then look away and hold a still face, and then return sort of to normal interaction. And I just want you to watch it to see what you notice, and then we'll debrief for a few minutes afterwards, okay? Do you need some help? Yeah. It played a minute ago.
Babies.
If it, that's strange because it played smoothly a minute ago, but if it doesn't, okay. Let's try one more time. I'm going to give it a second to see if it catches itself. Okay, if not, I have two choices. I could play it from the thing, but we didn't test it. Sorry guys, I thought I had tested it and that it worked. Is the thing still in?
Can you see?
No. Okay, Tronic SF. Let's see if we can play it from here, and if not, then I'm just going to walk you through it. Should I click OK?
You gotta hit the radio.
You have to pick that.
Recommend.
Pick the proper.
Thank you, I really can't read sideways.
Babies this
Yay.
young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. And the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Okay, so real quick, what did you notice? What stood out to you? Stress, yeah. The baby's stress, yeah. Mhm. Anything else? What relevance does this have for your work? Why would they put it in a Helping Babies from the Bench video? Yes, Jack Connors.
You know, I couldn't watch that much longer. I was just very scared. Just stop it, stop it. I don't want the baby starts crying. And I think that might be where we all run in, seeing the baby at risk and say, we just want to stop that.
Yes.
And yank them out.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And I'm glad you bring that up, because we do things that we do out of good intention, right? Like, there really is good intention. And, you know, how do we then sort of slow down and think through, okay, good intention is good, but also how do we make a decision that's most sort of effective in achieving our hoped for outcome? But it is hard to watch, right? It is, and it's very brief. So a couple of things about that. One, I hope that one of the things you take away from it is that even very, very young babies notice things like, my caregiver is gone. I get asked not infrequently, like if I had $1 for every time someone asks me, if we remove before, you know, 10 months of age, 6 months of age, 1 year, 3 year, like when does it really start to matter? And I understand the question and the wish is for an answer that says it doesn't matter that much before they're verbal, for example, but actually the data tell us quite the opposite, that early removals and early experiences of separation have a more profound and long-lasting effect on the child than even later removals. That doesn't mean later removals are fine, but I'm going to say a little bit more about that. So young kids notice. The other thing is, this little kid had an expectation of her parent being involved, right? Could you tell? How could you tell? She was like calling for her mom, she was reaching out, she was trying to get her involved. Well, that's great. I bet a lot of times for the kiddos that we see, they might not look so actively engaged or so responsive because maybe the environment has been more of a still face all along. And so one thing you might be thinking to yourself is, well, if that environment is already such a still face environment all along, isn't it better if we remove them? Well, the movie doesn't get into this part. But what I want to offer to you is that the data overwhelmingly tell us not so simple. Because actually, young children and older children, even if the environment is harmful, even if it is difficult, form attachments to their caregivers. And disrupting those attachments is stressful. So it causes harm. And that doesn't mean that we don't always need, that we might not sometimes need to do it, but it should certainly give us pause and make us really think about that. Anything else anyone wants to say about this before I continue on?
I would say you're right on point.
Oh, thank you. I thought I
My
might be.
humble opinion.
Thank you. Well, I did think that I might be coming to preach to the choir, so I am. I'm glad if that just supports sort of the thinking that you're doing already. Let's continue. Yes.
I mean, I just want to name, well,
Yes.
as a dad, like it was
Yes.
really painful to watch. Must have been so hard for the mom to do that.
Yes.
But it was also kind of remarkable by how fast the baby bounced back
Yes.
once she turned back. I just
Yes.
kind of thought about like, and I know it's like a tiny situation, but like if she left the room
Mm-hmm.
and it was someone else who came in to comfort the baby, it would have gone horribly. It wouldn't have been that super
That's
safe.
right. It wouldn't have just been anyone goes, actually. We know that for sure. On the other hand, we do know that babies will form attachments to their next caregivers, right? Which is a complicated fact for us too, because, and I'll say this, I'll actually save what I'm going to say later for later, or else I'm going to run out of time. But I'm glad you brought that up, because it's hard for the parent too. And, you know, when we do removals, I'm going to talk about the effect on the kids today. But we need to think also about the effect on the parent, motivation, you know, efforts to reunify. All of those things we have some data to suggest are diminished when removals happen and when visits don't happen more frequently. All right, so will you just fast forward through the list? Okay, so when you remove kids, there's a monsoon of stress hormones. We see increased risk for mental health problems, poor attachment, all kinds of very poor outcomes. There are also often multiple ambiguous losses. We can talk about that. Young children in particular are a special sort of risk and unfortunately are the largest group that enters care, so the largest age group, about 40% under the age of 6. And this is really deleterious because of the centrality of attachment for all development. Young kids have a different sense of time. Removing kids for just a couple of weeks is a forever sort of proposition for them. Removing kids and not having a visit happen for a week is a major trauma and grief for a young child who doesn't have the capacity to understand time in the same ways or use language to help with coping. So we really need to think in baby terms, not adult terms. There's also a really big likelihood that grief and trauma reactions are missed, overlooked, or not understood. And once kids are removed, there's an increased risk for subsequent removals.
And why is that?
There are a lot, that's a good question. There are a lot of reasons. One is that sometimes the placements that we find don't work out for some reason, which I imagine you all have some experience with. The other is that kids who have experienced removals are in fact more likely to act out and be difficult and challenging, and that may lead to placement disruptions occurring. And so there's actually some really nice research looking at a very sad sort of pattern where the more kids are affected by removals, the more they act out, which then leads to a greater risk for subsequent removals. We really need to stop the train, you know.
When you're talking removal, you're also talking about replacement.
I am talking also about replacement, because from the baby's experience, even a child's perspective, you know, they go into a new place and they hit the ground, starting to form new relationships, and losing those is another disruption. It is another loss. So, all right. Important here, even very young kids experience grief and loss, and children grieve relationships, even if they weren't safe or they were harmful. It's inconvenient for us. I wish that they didn't. It would be so much easier but the fact is that they do, right? And when we overlook it or minimize it, we can have the potential to do harm. And I understand why we do. I think it goes to the point that you were raising, that it feels so bad to know that something we're doing is also hurtful and to know that kids suffer. And so I think we tend to sort of try and minimize that, or think, well, thank God it's so early, or he's not going to remember this, right? But unfortunately, that's not how it works. Next. Okay. It's not only babies who have effects, though. So I want to share some things that we know from qualitative research with kids who are in the child welfare system. When they're interviewed or about their experiences, we see that they often experience a separation as a significant rejection or a loss. They often feel a loss of control. Some describe feeling kidnapped, powerless, helpless. There's often a real deep sense of betrayal, including to the person maybe that was the confidant that they told, who then led to a report that sort of led to the outcome. And it can reduce feelings of trust and create a sense that the world is unsafe. There's also a lot of confusion or unpredictability. There's fear of unknown, especially if there's not information, and a sense of guilt or failure that even older kids and youth tell us they have. It's also true that it's pretty painful. If, I think none of us want to be judged by our worst moments, right? And so think about what it means to a youth who's being interviewed, and the stories that are being told are all about sort of the worst moments in family life, right? Is this how we're being understood? Is this how we're being judged? And all the disruptions that occur. And also, worries about parents, what's happening to my mom, what's happening to my dad, siblings if they're not together, and real loyalty binds that can arise between foster parents and kin. Placement with kin is important, but doesn't protect from many of these things, right? So kids still experience losses, and sometimes kin really have a daunting task of claiming the child as their own without undermining their sister or their daughter, right? And for the child, that's a real dilemma, because the child needs someone who claims them as their child. So, even if you have a value for kin, don't sort of feel that you can disregard attending to these things, because it is important still in that context. I feel like the bad news person. I'm gonna share some good news. It's coming. All right. Already talked about the cortisol. Let's go on. All right, and I just made a point about this, that even if you were sort of thinking about removals from other foster parents, replacement, that's still a loss and is still a transition. And reunification is its own challenge, right? So there's often a loss of the foster parents. It's my wish that foster parents and bio parents would be supported in building relationships that allowed for the minimization of those kinds of disruptions and losses, and that transitions could be done in planful and intentional ways that would reduce this effect. Okay. So I do a lot of work also with military families, and I will tell you that even when you have time to prepare, even when you get lots of support, even when there are programs for you, separation and reunification are hard, right? We see it from families who maybe aren't struggling with all the same things that the families that we're working with and trying to support are. So let's hold that in mind. And foster care basically is not just the safe option, right? And that's sort of the point I want to make here. Go to the next slide. All right, let's continue. There are 2 bullets, okay. So 2 studies that are interesting, and there are more, but the first one that really looked at longitudinal study and looked at kids who had different placement outcomes and was able to compare sort of their status and their family functioning before placements, and found that kids who were placed in foster care were more likely to develop later problems than those who stayed at home. a second study, really interestingly done, with 15,000 kids, looked at caseworkers and their propensity to remove kids. Because it turns out we're not all the same, right? We have different thresholds. There are rules, there are regulations, but people make different decisions based on who they are. And so it looked at sort of the history of removals by caseworker, and then it looked at differences across kids' outcomes. And it found that the kids who were sort of involved in the caseloads of those who are more likely to remove fared worse than those who were more likely, probabilistically, to not remove. So this has real implications, because are there times where we have to remove? Absolutely, right? But how many times is it ambiguous? How many times is that a hard decision, right? These data would tell us the erring should be at least very carefully considered, because the outcomes seem to be slightly worse when the propensity is to remove. Is that the...
Dr. I think,
Okay, yep, yes.
I think that the propensity to remove is even higher than we think,
Yeah,
because we who are with connected homes
yes,
or upper middle class,
Yes.
middle class, we view these situations that the children are in
yes,
as really bad.
yeah,
And they are bad.
Yep.
I think it's, I don't
Right.
think it's abnormal to
Right.
react to these situations. But we don't understand that MIT study that you're
Yes.
talking about.
right,
Because we want to come in and we want
Yep.
to save the children.
Yep.
We want to help the children. How many times do I hear DHS say, we want to help you?
yep,
And so I don't think it's just, I think that window of that having to remove because it's bad.
right, it's small. And the sort of, I hear you saying that this makes sense to you because people do vary. And I think you're right that there are a lot of factors. When we think about, you know, a willingness to remove, for example, for environmental neglect, it might be poverty driven, or we think about issues of racism and implicit bias and, you know, the resources that people have, all of those things do come into play in these decisions. So absolutely really important. I'm going to move on so I can get to
Absolutely.
a few more slides. But basically the point here being, it would have been hard for us to devise a system that was harder to navigate in some ways for families and for kids. And it takes us a lot of effort and professional training to understand all the rules that regulate this, right? Families don't have that advantage. Continue. Oh yeah, just go right through, sorry. I'm used to having my own clicker, and you're doing a great job, but it's, okay. Continue, yeah. Okay, so even when in placement, and just keep going, that's right, we're gonna go to, so even in placement, we do have data that tell us that bad things happen in foster care too, right? So we have to be really also thinking about that potential, another reason to really slow the train down. Continue. And outcomes long-term for kids who leave the system are not positive. So I'll let you read that in your own slides. Okay, here's where I want to share a little bit of good news. So prevention and intervention and addressing root causes can make a difference, and this is where I think hopefully the work that I do can contribute, and all of us can sort of do to think about how do we prevent disruptions and poor outcomes from happening. So while simply removing a child from a dangerous environment doesn't automatically reverse the impact of that experience, I have a colleague who says children never forget what they can't remember, which is powerful. Next slide. We do know that interventions can make a difference for strengthening parenting and strengthening child outcomes. And I don't have here a comprehensive list. If you want a comprehensive list, the place to go is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, nctsn.org. And also the Clearinghouse for Child Welfare. I put that here for you. But interventions and preventions can work, and the question is whether we have the will and the effort to fund and support those kinds of things that we know can support family preservation and reduce the need for removal. So that's one sort of point. And the other is that we really need to attend to the context. So everyone here familiar with the ACEs? The ACEs don't come from nowhere, right? The ACEs come from environments that support and sort of grow those poor outcomes. And so we really need to be thinking about sort of what's beneath the soil here and leading to these poor outcomes, and we need to address those root causes, those social determinants. I want to expand your thinking about the ACEs for a moment, so when you start thinking about that, you'll have two new ways of thinking about it too. Colleagues in Philadelphia have been developing the expanded urban ACEs, so we need to be thinking not just about what's happening in the home, but also what's happening in the environment. Do you feel safe in your community? Are people dying? Are people being shot? Are people being arrested? Are you watching your neighbor be pulled off by the police? Like, all of these things have impacts on kids and on environments, and are also adverse childhood experiences. And those things don't happen in a vacuum either. So a very dear colleague of mine developed what she calls the historical original ACEs, and that stands for atrocious cultural experiences, not just adverse childhood experiences, but thinking about what is the origin of some of these social determinants in slavery, in colonization, in forced family separations, and how these lead to poor outcomes for people. Why am I saying this to you all? Because we have to be thinking about this. The sort of decisions we make on an everyday basis happen in a context, and we need to take responsibility for that, attend to it, and really think carefully about removals. Next slide. This is just another way of showing the same thing. Okay. At the end here, because I know I'm out of time. But there are additional issues if a child is removed that come up. But what I really want to underscore is, let's be intentional. Let's not do the status quo. I think with Judge Connors, you're in good shape for that. It's not the status quo only that, we're really thinking about peacemaking court. How phenomenal. Really thinking about how do we make intentional decisions. If removal has to happen, how can we facilitate relationships between bio parents and foster parents so that kids have fewer losses and maintain relationships? How can we think creatively about efforts to reunify and ramp up visitation and maintain relationships beyond the period of returning? And go on. How can we ourselves take responsibility for reducing the factors in the inequity that leads to removal in the first place and really mitigate those effects long term? So more nuanced decision making. We're always weighing a balance of harms. That is what you do. And I want us to do that with the full weight of all the evidence sort of in front of us as we're making those decisions. I think that's it. Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do on behalf of children and families. I'm very grateful to present to you today.